Thank you all very much for, if you can't hear me, do please just let me know, and certainly if you have any questions while I'm talking, or rambling as the case may be, certainly just indicate that you have a question. I'd be happy to take those as we progress. The other thing that I should indicate is that when I got my new prescription for my glasses, I should have got progressive lenses, so I will be actually lifting and putting my glasses down throughout, just as I begin reading off of my notes here that are unfortunately on the computer because technology is so wonderful. My printer decided to crash today, so I wasn't able to print them out. So I will be, I apologize, reading off of my computer. But again, as I said, I do have a little bit of the talk written down, and then after that I'll just be sort of talking just ad hoc off the cuff. So this I've titled Mapping Fantasy, Fantasy Literature, and the Epic Tradition. And so when I was asked to talk today about mapping, I kind of took mapping more metaphorically as opposed to literally. And so I'm going to be talking about the sort of metaphorical mapping of a contemporary fantasy literature. But the central point that I'm going to be making throughout today's talk, which should run about half an hour to 40 minutes at most, is that fantasy literature, often derided as something that's escapist, that's written for what might be called nerdy adolescents, it is actually rooted in the beginning of Western literary tradition. It is rooted in the epic tradition. And so this then is mapping fantasy, fantasy literature, and the epic tradition. So today I will be discussing the roots of fantasy literature, in part in an attempt to show that fantasy is not a genre to be disparaged, not simply escapist literature written for what might be called nerdy adolescents. To the contrary, fantasy is part of a long tradition that can trace its roots back to the dawn of Western civilization. At its heart, my talk argues that fantasy is a continuation of the epic tradition that begins for us on the printed page of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the great ancient Greek epic poems. I will then discuss how contemporary fantasy, and when I talk about contemporary fantasy, I should clarify that I am talking about high fantasy, what might be considered to be literary fantasy, such as J.R. Tolkien and others of his ilk, including the Inklings, C.S. Lewis being one among them. So I am talking about high fantasy, not what might be considered to be swords and sorcery or Dungeons and Dragons and that sort of thing. Not disparaging Dungeons and Dragons by any stretch. It's one of my favorite games. So to continue on, in other words, through what, sorry, I'm going to have to lift up here, what is often considered to be escapism and brain candy, contemporary fantasists are able to comment obliquely on sensitive and controversial topics, but in the relative safety and comfort of a fabricated world. And if we think about fantasy as part of speculative fiction, we might even begin to think of Star Trek in the 1960s, the original series, where we actually have a black woman as the third, I believe, in command of the Enterprise, which in 1960s America was an incredible advance for racial relations and certainly a commentary on racial relations and racial tensions in America during that time. So finally, I will address the importance of geography to fantasy literature, from the frequency with which maps appear at the front of fantasy books to the role geography and land play in the plot of many fantasy stories, from the mapping of the known world in Homer's Iliad to how sorcerers gain their magical powers from the land of Tigana, a novel by Canadian fantasist Guy Gavriel Kay. And if you're not familiar with Guy Gavriel Kay's work, I certainly encourage you to read it. He's a wonderful, wonderful just writer in general, let alone a fantasist. So over the next 40 minutes or so, probably a little bit less than 40 minutes, I will attempt to map fantasy literature. And to begin, we must begin before the written word, before literature itself, in the days of what might be called orature. So orature being a recognition of literature that existed before the printed word, or oral literature. And we must imagine this as there are no records, obviously. But we can imagine that people around a fire, after the day's hunting and gathering had been completed, began to tell stories of the day, stories of the season, and stories of their history. In other words, they began to map themselves onto the world with oral narratives, the stories themselves becoming a repository of knowledge and history. They were in many ways then beginning to tell themselves into existence. And so as I begin to talk today, there will be several topics that I will touch on throughout the talk. And one of them that comes up surprisingly is gender. That gender does actually play an incredible role in this fantasy literature. And tied into that, obviously, is lineage and the significance of lineage throughout both the epic tradition and fantasy literature itself. The significance of naming, the importance of language, that often we see in contemporary fantasy literature, that the power of the word is particularly significant, that magical worlds are sung into existence, for instance, with J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, that magical systems of power actually are rooted in language itself. And so the significance of language, the significance of narrative. And as we will see when we get to the Iliad, the way in which that very narrative, the way in which that poem, the Iliad, works in some ways to preserve the immortality of Achilles himself. So that it becomes in some ways a kind of self-reflexive or self-fulfilling prophecy here. As well, we will be talking about objects, the role of objects, the significance of powerful objects, both again in the epic tradition and in fantasy literature itself. If anyone is a gamer of video games, fantasy video games, certainly we see the way in which dropped objects, when you defeat a creature, creates a certain kind of power that we see. That actually also having its roots in fantasy literature and the epic tradition itself. So the beginning then of the epic tradition that I'm going to be talking about once again begins with orature. It begins with the oral storytelling as people began to narrate themselves into existence, but also beginning to preserve their history. Okay, and we can see this developing into the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the epic, or what's also called the heroic poems. Now, we have to think about Homer, who is attributed, the Iliad and the Odyssey are attributed to Homer, but Homer is not really a kind of author as we understand authors. That in many ways, Homer is recognized as a figure who is really representing a long history of non-written literature, that Homer is really a representative of an entire cultural history that he is just sort of given a kind of attribution as the writer of this, but he's not really an author as we might imagine an author, as a single individual genius who is sitting up in his garret apartment writing frantically and coming down at the end of the evening saying, look at this wonderful story that I've created. That really Homer does have this long cultural history behind him, and he is just given this attribution. There's some debate, in fact, of whether Homer as a person existed, and so on. But he is represented quite frequently as the blind poet, right? And that's often a trope that we see, that the people who are that are able to see, that are able to forecast the future, are also often represented as being blind. So these are the epic poems, or the heroic poems. And M.H. Abrams, who is a wonderful taxonomist of literature, his definition of literary terms is one of the fantastic works in literary criticism. He says that the epic or heroic poem is, and this is a direct quote, a long verse narrative on a serious subject, so it has to be a serious subject, it can't be parodic or satirical, in a formal and elevated style. And that's something that I want to emphasize as well, is that this idea of the formal or the elevated style is particularly important to this. A formal and elevated style that focuses on a heroic or quasi-divine figure. So it's a figure who is heroic, or in fact might be partly divine. And we can see that with Achilles, that he is in fact the son of Thetis, one of the river nymphs. And so he actually does have divine blood within him. So we see this heroic or quasi-divine hero. And this hero has the fate of a tribe, a nation, or humanity resting on his shoulders. So it's either a group of people, an entire nation, or all of humanity that this person comes to save. And I would even argue that the popularity of comic DC and Marvel movies right now is also rooted in this very same tradition, that we see these superhuman deeds being performed for us on the big screen, and that popularity is I would argue, once again rooted in this epic tradition. So I'm just going to be talking about two different kinds of epics before I get into the features and the conventions of the epic. So there are two different kinds of epics that exist in the ancient world. And the first is the oral epic, okay, or the traditional epic, and that is Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the second one is what is often called the literary epic. And the literary epic is a literary figure, an author that we understand as an author, who is imitating the style of that oral tradition. So it's not an oral tradition, it's a new story, it's a new narrative, but it's imitating that style of the epic tradition of Homer, for instance. And so we have Virgil, who is writing in Latin, and he is telling the story of the founding of Rome. And Aeneas leaves Iliad after the fall of Troy. He leaves Ilium and ends up founding Rome. It's one of the competing narratives of the founding of Rome. Either it's the two twins suckled by a wolf at the Tigris and Euphrates, or it's Aeneas coming from Iliad and bringing the old gods from the old world to Rome, and that's the founding of Rome. And so that's the story that Virgil tells in the Aeneid. But he imitates and he mimics the tradition of the oral epic, okay? And so that's what we have here, the two different kinds. Now, again, M.H. Abrams identifies 5 features of the epic poem. And the first is that is a hero of national or cosmic importance, okay? So this isn't just someone who's stopping crime. This isn't someone who's just saving his family or something like this. This is cosmic importance, okay? And so once again, that we have the gods involved. And that's one of the other features. That's the second feature, is that the gods are themselves involved in the affairs of humans, okay? And so what we have, for instance, when Achilles is raging at the beginning of the Iliad and he's ready to kill Agamemnon, what happens is that Pallas Athena comes down and pulls him by the back of the hair to prevent him from killing Agamemnon. So she is actually, even in that first book, involved in the battle. And so you have the gods as well, with their petty differences and so on, also engaged in this ongoing battle between the humans. So that's the second one, is the involvement of the gods. And the setting is ample. So when we think of the Odyssey with this ample setting, that in fact was the known world at the time. That what we see is Odysseus, actually, who has angered Poseidon, once again the gods becoming involved, who sends the winds and sends the seas to scatter Odysseus to different distant shores and so on, so he's not able actually to make it home to Ithaca. And so what we see then is effectively Odysseus traveling the known world of the Mediterranean that existed at that time. So in many ways, it is figuratively, once again, mapping that world, right? That we see that the mapping of that world again. Superhuman deeds in battle is another one of the features of the epic, so that we have Achilles, who is able to kill swaths of the Trojans as they're coming out from behind the walls without a problem. And once again, this could be considered to be the birth of the superhero, right? That we have the semi-divine, the quasi-divine hero Achilles killing numerous characters. And we often have the battle of what might be considered to be the hero and the anti-hero. So we have Hector and Achilles actually battling outside the walls of Troy in some way that we might see the Spider-Man battling Dr. Octopus or something to that effect, okay? And finally, the other feature is that it is a ceremonial performance, okay? That this is a performance that, particularly in the oral tradition, that these were poems that would have been recited. And we look at the length of the books of the Iliad and think, how would this possibly be recited? But it was performed often at dinners as people were lounging and eating, and each performance would have been different. If someone was falling asleep or what have you, they would speed up that particular scene, or if people were engaged in a particular battle, they would draw out the battle and continue with this oral tale telling. And we look at this and think, how was that possibly memorized? Okay? But that's the thing about Homer, and that's the thing about the epic, is that they weren't memorized. they changed with each telling. And so what we see is that there are particular set scenes. So Achilles dons his armor, and it has very, very similar lines to when Hector is donning his armor. So that there would have been particular ways in which the particular scenes would have been relatively easy for a poet to tell, because they would have been kind of like a stock narrative. And as they're engaged in the stock narrative, the poet then would be thinking ahead and composing the lines of the next new scene that he was telling. Okay, and so we often see tags, because you also have to remember that this is actually in meter. This is metered verse. Okay, that this is actually metrical verse. But that makes it easier to memorize to some extent, because you get into a pattern and you're able then to sort of fall into the pattern, and you end up with tags. So often you get the fleet-footed Achilles, for instance, as this tag, and that just fills in the metrical form that is required at that particular time as the poet is reciting. And so once again, that is the oral tradition, that is the traditional epic poem, not the literary epic poem. So those are sort of the features of the epic that I wanted to talk about before getting into the epic conventions. And when we start talking about the epic conventions, this is really where we see where contemporary fantasists are drawing from this epic tradition. And so once again, M.H. Abrams identifies several conventions, 4 of them. One is the Invocation of the Muse. Sing, God of the son of Peleus' rage, okay? Sing of the rage of Achilles. And it's an invocation of the muse. That the ancient Greeks did not actually believe that a poet was simply composing or was simply reciting a poem, but they actually believed that the poet was speaking on behalf of the muses, was speaking on behalf of the gods. And so this invocation, this inspiration, this literal drawing of breath, was an invocation of the muse to say, effectively, please let me sing this tale properly. Okay, so let me tell this tale properly. So we have the invocation of the muse. We have a narrative that starts in media res. And media res is a Latin phrase that just means in the middle of things. Okay, so it starts in the middle of things. When we begin the Iliad, we're 10 years into a 10-year war. This is right before the fall of Troy. We don't even actually get the narrative of the Trojan city falling. Ilium does not actually fall in the narrative poem, but it begins in the middle. Okay, so it begins in the middle of things, and we see Achilles and Agamemnon arguing. Okay, and so it's starting right in the middle of things. You might want to think of this as the sort of opening of movies that starts with a really big action sequence, and then we get sort of the background filled in afterwards. It's very much the same kind of thing, that we're beginning in the middle of things, in media res as it's called. Another feature is catalogs, okay, that the poets are meticulously cataloging throughout their narratives. When I teach my fantasy literature course, I teach 4 books of the Iliad. I don't force them to read all of it. And I joke with them and say, I was going to put the second book on, but I've decided not to put the second book of the Iliad on, because the second book is only a catalog of the ships that are arriving from Greece to the mainland of Troy. And it's only a catalog, this probably 400, 500 lines of poetry devoted to naming ships, naming families, but what this is the trace of that history. Here's a family ship that has come to help Agamemnon. Here's another family ship and so it's actually recording that history in an oral tradition, saying this family is associated with Agamemnon, this family is associated with Achilles, and so on. And so that's what that second book is. It's incredibly dull to read, I would imagine, unless you're an ancient scholar, which I am not. But it's incredibly dull to read, because it is effectively the history of all of these people. And this used to be imagined to be a fiction, right? The Iliad is just a fiction. It's just the workings of a culture telling their superhero stories, right? That's often what it was considered to be. Until Heinrich Schliemann in 1870 discovered Troy. They actually discovered Troy, and then people had to reimagine and say, hold on, this is a narrative that is actually based on, I'm not saying that there was a figure named Achilles who killed hundreds of men with a single throw of his spear, but what we see then is they had to reimagine this as a recognition that there was an historical event or several historical events. They do think that perhaps it's several stories layered on top of each other in this place that actually did occur in Troy, in Ilium. So again, we have this documentation of history happening in these epics. And they also have epic similes. Okay, so epic similes are these long, multi-lined similes. So instead of Robert Burns' my love is like a red, red rose, very simple simile. What we get is my love is like a red, red rose in a garden that is filled with manure, that's tended by a giant ogre who had a fight with his brother. And it's this long, long narrative within itself that is simply a simile. That's something I made up on the spot. That's not actually something that exists in the Iliad, just so you know. But you have these long epic similes that are once again another one of the conventions of the epic. So to talk then about the Iliad, I'll just talk very briefly about the Iliad. It is considered to be, or at least Homer is considered to be, the beginning of Western civilization, or at least the written component of Western civilization, Western literature in itself. And I am going to be, I do have to admit, that this is a very Western-centric talk. I simply do not have the background or the knowledge to be able to talk about Asian epics or African epics and so on, but those do also exist. But here in North America, certainly, we are drawing mostly from the Western tradition itself, but I did want to recognize that this is Western-centric in its, this talk is Western-centric in its approach. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the story of the Iliad. This is a 24-book poem. I'm going to do it in 2 minutes, okay? So I'm going to be leaving out a whole lot of stuff. And so I've actually got this written down, and we'll see if I can do this in 2 minutes. Okay, so it begins once again in media res with Achilles, the great quasi-divine hero, fighting with Agamemnon, who is the leader of the Greeks, outside of the Trojan walls, okay? And what they're arguing about, in fact, is that Agamemnon has had to give up his prize, which is a woman, in order to appease the gods. And so Agamemnon, in order to save face, says to Achilles, I need your woman. He needs Briseis to come to him. And so Achilles begins to pout. And he says, fine, if you're taking my woman, my booty, as it were, then I will no longer fight. I'm not going to fight. And he goes to his tent and he sulks. And he pouts and he says, that's it, I'm not fighting. What ends up happening at that time is that the Trojans begin to win. The Trojans begin to come out from behind the walls and begin defeating the Greeks. And so Patroclus, who is the best friend of Achilles, potentially his lover as well. This is an ongoing debate within scholarship, whether Patroclus was in fact a lover of Achilles, says, Achilles, please come out. And Achilles says, nope, I have to save face and I'm no longer fighting. So Patroclus says, let me don your armor. Let me put your armor on so the Trojans think that you are coming out. Okay, once again, that idea of the significance of the object, that role the armor plays. So Patroclus puts on the armor, he goes out and he meets Hector, the hero of Troy. And Hector comes out and kills Patroclus and takes his armor. Okay, so now Hector has this great armor that used to belong to Achilles. And so what ends up happening at this point is that Achilles flies into a rage. He's just grief-stricken that his best friend / lover Patroclus is dead on the battlefield. And so he goes to his mommy and says, I need armor. And so what Thetis does, who's the nymph, river nymph, goes to Hephaestus, the Greek god of forge, the forge, the blacksmith, and says, please make armor for my son. And so there's an entire book, once again, devoted to the construction of the armor, which is about 100 lines, and then about 400 or 500 lines of a discussion of Achilles' shield. Okay, and so there's this creation of the shield, and on this shield is effectively the entire world represented on the shield. So we have this art within art, right? So we have which is called ekphrasis, okay? So it's this art, the shield, within the art of the poem itself. So we have art within art, and that's going to be something we talk about is the significance and the role of art and poetry itself. So Achilles gets his armor and he says, that's it, I'm going to go out. But he recognizes in this going out to the field that he has decided, because for the entire poem, he's debating about whether he lives a long life in peace and dies without a name, or he dies in violence and gains immortality through the stories people will tell. In other words, the Iliad itself. And so he says, because Patroclus is dead, I'm going out onto the battlefield. I will die and live on forever in the Iliad that we're actually reading, effectively. Okay. So he goes out. He does meet Hector on the battlefield, and he does defeat Hector. He stabs Hector in the throat with his spear. Hector lies on the battlefield. Despite having a spear wound in the throat, he has a long final statements that he makes about please don't defile my body. And then obviously Achilles then drags his body around Troy, defiling the body, and he does that 3 times. And then he goes back, and effectively that's the end of the Iliad. And I think that was longer than 2 minutes, but roughly 2 minutes, the Iliad. And so what we know then happens is that Achilles dies, right? The Achilles heel, that's what was not protected. He ends up dying with an arrow wound there, and Troy falls. Okay, and from Troy falling, Aeneas leaves and founds Rome. Okay, so that's the narrative that we have there. Things that are important to keep in mind, though, about the Iliad then, are the idea of the object, the significance of the object, the significance of the name, the significance of Achilles coming out to the battlefield when in fact it was Patroclus, right? And so these superhuman deeds that we have happening here. Poetry and song and that art of immortality, the art and immortality, the way in which they're related, we often see that again and again in contemporary fantasy as well. Fate and free will. Right? In fact, there are suggestions that the gods themselves cannot change fate. Zeus wants the Trojans to win, but he recognizes that there is a fate that Troy will fall. Okay, so that we see this ongoing debate about free will, free agency, and fate. And again, the power of names and language, as I have suggested. And so that's the ancient Greek epic that I'm talking about here. We have something similar in English literature. We obviously don't necessarily have the tradition, but something very similar developed in England. And this is Beowulf. Okay, and the oldest extant or the oldest existing epic poem in English. It's not really English, it's Anglo-Saxon, and if you've ever heard Anglo-Saxon, it sounds a little bit like Swedish. It kind of sounds like the Swedish chef on the Muppets. So that's Anglo-Saxon. So it's not entirely English. It is in fact considered to be a different language. They had different letters such as thorn and so on. But it is the oldest extant epic poem in English. It was composed around somewhere between the 7th and 10th century. And it is an anonymous poem, okay? So it's not, there isn't a named poet. It is an anonymous poem. It was written in England, okay? So it was written in England, but it's about events in Scandinavia, okay? So that's what's happening in Beowulf, is that the events are in Scandinavia, but it is written in England. It exists in one manuscript. We're incredibly fortunate, in fact, to have Beowulf, because it exists in only one manuscript. In a codex, and a codex is basically what we understand as a book, a bound bunch of vellum. Vellum was sheepskin, and that's the old paper, effectively, is that they would use tanned sheepskin, and there were no spaces. Okay, there were no line breaks. There was nothing like that, because vellum was so expensive. They just wrote sort of in a block and filled as much of the page as they possibly could on this skin on vellum. And in fact, we have something where we often see previous texts sort of underneath the text that we can read, because what they would do is they would scrape the skin and reuse that actually as another text was written over top of another one. Okay, a palimpsest it's called, where you can sort of see the other one ghosting beneath it. So it existed in the library of James Cotton, okay, an English peer. And it was bound with other texts that were about monsters. And so that's effectively why they think that it was bound in this, is that all the stories had to do with monsters. Now, in the 18th century, it was moved to a house called Ashburnhamdom House. And given that name, it probably should not surprise you that there was a fire in that house. Ashburnhamdom had a fire, and Beowulf, the book, not the hero, Beowulf was thrown from the window and saved, though it was badly damaged. But we were very, very lucky, in fact, to have this text left. Now, when it was initially studied, it was really studied by Anglo-Saxon scholars as just an example of the Anglo-Saxon language. And they would go through and they would say, this translates to this. And they would very much focus on the linguistics of the language itself, until one scholar in England came along and said, no, we have to look at this as the root of English literature. That scholar, incidentally, J.R.R. Tolkien. And he wrote an article called Beowulf and the Critics, okay, where he talked about, let's actually talk about this as an example of English literature, early English literature. And he actually changed the scholarship on Beowulf from the linguistics to the actual literature itself. So Beowulf in 2 minutes. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Beowulf, Beowulf in 2 minutes. What we have is we have a hero whose lineage is not entirely known. We're not entirely sure who his mother is. He's a foundling. His name is Beowulf. There are stories of problems over with the Geats, and so Beowulf says, I'm going to go over and I'm going to save them. So he goes over, and what they find is that there is a monster who is haunting the house where King Hrothgar is. So there's this monster, and the monster, incidentally, is just evil. And this is something that we see again and again throughout contemporary fantasy literature as well. Good versus evil. Really very clearly defined examples of good versus evil. Same things happen in superhero movies and so on. Good and evil are very clearly defined, that there is no sort of gray area there. And so Grendel is the name of this beast who is killing everyone. And so Grendel is really upset by the songs that are sung in the house, in the mead hall it's called, of Hrothgar. And so it's actually culture and it's humanity that is in some ways angering Grendel. So Grendel comes when Beowulf is there. Beowulf rips off his arm, and then they track Grendel, and Grendel dies. But Grendel has a mother. Okay, and so the mother lives at the bottom of a mere, lives at the bottom of a lake. And Grendel's mother then, Beowulf goes to the lake. And once again, talking about women, okay, and lineage, there are things called a strange lake birth. And they are believed to be the daughter and son of Cain, okay? So that we actually have the lineage of Grendel and Grendel's mother being traced back to the first murderer Cain in the Bible. And what we see is, in fact, an early Christian author taking a pagan Scandinavian story and mapping Christianity onto it. Okay, so that there's sort of a retelling of this pagan tale, but through a Christian lens, which is really quite fascinating, where we see these two cultures blending in Beowulf. So when they get to the lake, when they get to the mere, there are these strange creatures that are lying dead on the shore, and it's called literally a strange lake birth. Okay, so we have this idea of lineage once again, that she's creating these strange creatures that are dead on the side of the mere. What happens is that a figure that a character that Beowulf initially had difficulty with lends him his sword, and it's a named sword. Once again, that idea of naming objects. It's a named sword, and its name is Hrunting. So Beowulf takes Hrunting and dives for 3 days under the lake. Okay, 3 days he's under the lake. But he's under the lake with this sword called Hrunting. And he encounters Grendel's mother there. And he takes Hrunting, this is once again a child whose mother is not entirely certain, takes Hrunting and tries to stab Grendel's mother with it. The sword melts. Okay, so we have a sword encountering the evil female that then melts. I don't think we necessarily need to be Freud to sort of get what might be actually sort of a happening in this narrative. So what happens is he finds from ancient times a weapon of the giants, and he takes the giant sword and actually severs the head of Grendel's mother. And so that's it, and then it says, and then he ruled in his kingdom for 50 years. One line in this long poem, 50 years go by, and it's like in the movies. And later that day, right, so 50 years later, after this kind rule, what ends up happening is that a thief sneaks into the barrow, sneaks into the lair of a dragon, and he steals a cup. He takes the cup, and the dragon wakens and starts burning everyone, and so on, until Beowulf says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to once again save my people. So you have to imagine that he'd be around 70 at this point, if he's ruled for 50 years well. And I tell my students that you can imagine perhaps that Beowulf has gone out with his walker to fight the dragon, because it's been 50 years that he's been ruling quite well. So the dragon comes down. He injures the dragon, but it's his friend Wiglaf who actually ends up killing the dragon. Okay, and Beowulf says, I would very much like to look at this treasure, and he looks at the treasure of the dragon that is then there for the people. But then everyone recognizes that that's the end of the Geats. That's the end of Beowulf. That's the end of his family, because he had no heir. Okay, once again, that melting sword, he had no heir, which is really where women in the ancient epics and in Beowulf gain their power, is through the maternal body, that they're able in many ways to gain their power only through passing on male heirs, and that's why they were valued, why they were considered treasure, and so on. Because really, women are treated terribly in these epics, that they are very much objects, that they are very much seen as treasure, and certainly not necessarily heroic. And so that's Beowulf. Those are the roots of fantasy literature. And I did mention J.R.R. Tolkien and Beowulf and the critics, because I want to use that as sort of a segue into contemporary fantasy. And although fantasy existed, and we can look at fairy tales as fantasy and so on, prior to Tolkien, really I would argue that our conception of fantasy literature, of high fantasy, really begins with J.R.R. Tolkien. And The Hobbit initially began as a narrative that he would tell his son, Christopher Tolkien, before going to bed. Okay, so once again, that oral tradition, the tales that he's telling his son, end up becoming this world that he creates. And he's got Elvish languages. I say that my great fear when I start my first day of fantasy in the summer course, that I walk in and students are sitting together talking in Elvish, right? Like I'm terrified that people are going to know so much about Tolkien that they are actually speaking in Elvish, because he does have languages. He has an entire religious system created. He's got this entire world, this entire mythos that's created. But what we have with The Hobbit is very much a kid's narrative. Okay, it's very much a child's story. And if you are familiar with the trilogy, with the Lord of the Rings, even Gandalf, the character of Gandalf, who is very powerful, almost a godlike figure in the Lord of the Rings, is really kind of petty and a very different character in The Hobbit. He's almost very much like a child himself, at least in the printed version, not the movie. So he's very, very different. Where we see him, fighting the Balrog in Lord of the Rings, he's lighting pine cones on fire and throwing them at wolves in The Hobbit. So it's a very different kind of power that we see here with Gandalf. But what the story of The Hobbit is, if you're unfamiliar, is that there's a hobbit or a halfling, so a person that's half the size, and my 11-year-old son calls me the Hobbit, so because he's about this tall, so I'm very happy with that. So we have a Hobbit then who is taken along with 13 dwarves to go back to the Lonely Mountain where Smaug the dragon is living. And incidentally, I did look up the word Smaug, and etymologically it exists before the publication of The Hobbit, because we can really read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings in some ways as a lament for the loss of the rural tradition, right? It's the industrialization. And one of the things that really sent Tolkien fans into a tizzy with the development of the movies, the films, was that they left out the final chapter of the trilogy, which is called the Scouring of the Shire, where we actually see effectively factories that are being built in there, and it's not the kind of happy ending that we see in the film version. And so people got really upset, saying we're missing sort of the commentary of industrialization, which is one of the things that we can see here. And you see that very, very clearly, I would argue, in the films, right, where we have the orcs working the forges and working the what could be considered to be kind of factory work, constructing the Uruk-hai, the big nasty ogres, or orcs, effectively. From the goblins. So the corruption of elves is what they are. What happens is that he goes along on this trek, and they encounter two trolls. They fight the trolls, and then there they find treasure. Okay, they find elven swords, and so Gandalf takes a sword. The sword is given to Elrond, and Bilbo, who is the Hobbit, of the titular Hobbit, ends up with the sword as well, a little short sword that would have been considered a knife and so on. They go into Mirkwood Forest. They have to travel through there to get to the Lonely Mountain, so dark, nasty forest. Once again, we see this mapping of the Middle-earth, effectively, at this time as they're going through Mirkwood Forest. A bunch of spiders come down, and Bilbo stabs and kills a spider. And he says at this point, that you deserve a name, he says to his sword. You deserve a name. And so he actually names the sword Sting. And once again, there's that power of naming. The saying, here's Sting. And he feels much more like an adventurer, feels like a hero. And if anyone, once again, plays those video games, those role-playing games, this is effectively Bilbo leveling up, right? Like he's killed a spider and he levels up at this point. And so he goes on, and they get to the Lonely Mountain. Bilbo sneaks in and takes a cup. He steals a cup from Smaug. Remind you of anything? Beowulf. So absolutely, Tolkien took parts of Beowulf in the writing of The Hobbit. And what he said he wanted to do with The Hobbit was provide England with the same kind of mythology that existed beforehand. So he wanted to create this kind of fantastical past. So Bilbo takes the ring, and Smaug comes awake, and Bard, who is a man from Lake Town, ends up slaying the dragon with a magical arrow, effectively, and Smaug the dragon dies, and then the dwarves take over the Lonely Mountain after the Battle of Five Armies, and I didn't even mention the One Ring, okay? But which is really sort of the reason The Hobbit exists. But effectively, what we see here is a kind of retelling of Beowulf in The Hobbit, or sort of a reimagining of Beowulf. And this happened again with Michael Crichton, and Michael Crichton is probably best known as the writer of Jurassic Park, okay? But he also wrote another novel called The Eaters of the Dead. And allegedly what happened was that he had a dinner party and someone said, I don't like Beowulf because Beowulf is just filled with all of this magic and so on. And he's challenged Crichton to write a realistic narrative of Beowulf. How would Beowulf actually be grounded in reality? And so what Michael Crichton did was in fact remove all of the magic from Beowulf, all of the fantastical elements of Beowulf, and told a story where Grendel was in fact represented by a group of people who were effectively Neanderthals, the coexistence of humans and Neanderthals. So the Ven end up becoming the Grendel in the narrative here, and then Grendel's mother ends up becoming the female figure who is sort of the religious center of the Ven. And so it's a retelling of it that way. And the dragon that appears in Beowulf is actually cavalry with torches. It's the fireworm, as they call it, that comes down from the hills. And that's actually remade into a film that I teach in my fantasy course called The 13th Warrior, starring Antonio Banderas. It's a fantastic B movie. It's not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a really fun movie if you want to sit down and watch and spend an hour and a half watching Antonio Banderas slay Neanderthals. It's fun. So we have here then Beowulf being rewritten in The Hobbit and the birth, in many ways, of contemporary fantasy. Okay, there are no female characters in The Hobbit. Not one. Not one female character in The Hobbit. There's mention of one female character, and that is Bilbo's mother. Okay, who comes from the Took side. That's the Took side. And the Took side is the side that lets Bilbo go off adventuring. They're more adventuresome and so on. So in some ways, they're problematic, right? So we get this kind of problematizing of women. And Tolkien said that he wanted to have no female characters because he didn't want sexual tension in what was a kid's book. I'm not sure that necessarily entirely justifies not having any female characters, but that was his reasoning behind it. So what ends up happening is that with the absence of women or female characters, that what ends up happening is that the races within the Hobbit become gendered. So we have the uber masculine orcs, right? And we have the more feminine hobbits and elves. And so you can actually sort of map onto the races a kind of gender continuity, but going from, say, the hobbits to the orcs as the most masculine. So even in the absence of women, that nevertheless gender does play a role, even as Tolkien allegedly attempted to remove gender as a factor in the text. I'm going to talk about two more texts of contemporary fantasy. One might be argued whether it is in fact fantasy or not, and that is Ursula K Le Guin, famous for The Left Hand of Darkness, as well as the Wizard of Earthsea narratives. But hers, not very well known, a collection of short stories called Changing Plains. And it is a wonderful tale. Ursula K Le Guin's mother was an anthropologist at Berkeley. And so what we see here is that it came to Ursula K Le Guin apparently that this discomfort in airports where you're eating greasy food and you've got horrible seating and so on, allows you to, and she came up with this pun, change planes. Okay, so changing planes. So what ends up happening is that you're not just changing planes, you're actually changing planes, as in worlds. And so you travel to different worlds by eating greasy food and sitting in uncomfortable positions, and then you're able to change a plane to something else. But what these end up being are very, very specific commentaries on what's going on in society. And I'll take three stories as an example and just very briefly tell you about them. One is called Porridge on Ilek. And in Porridge on Ilek, it's a plane that is populated mostly by hyper-intelligent scientists. And they just willy-nilly just experiment. And they experiment with genomes, and they experiment with living cells and so on. And they create numerous different kinds of beings, effectively, that have different genomes imparted in them. And so one of the central characters, Aeneid, I believe her name was, is 80% corn. She's 80% corn, and this is what it is. But what we see in the commentary is that only people who are 99.99% pure human are able to hold positions of power, who are able to be in government and so on, okay? And if anyone recognizes 99.9% pure, that's actually from a Dove commercial, right? So it's also a play on that as well. So that's the island of Ilek, where she's really suggesting, why would we allow just sort of the experimentation without limitation on scientific advancements? And so that's one of the commentaries that she's making with Changing Plains. The Island of Great Joy is another one. And what happens on the Island of Great Joy is it's effectively a commentary on both colonization as well as a sort of celebratory culture that we have in the world today. In the Island of Great Joy, what we have is effectively it's Christmas all the time. Okay, it's Christmas 24 hours a day, 357 days a year that we have Christmas. And so what ends up happening is that your original inhabitants become the elves, and they become the workers, and so it's very much a commentary on consumerism and the way in which holidays, holy days, are corrupted into something that is very much commercialized. And finally, the last story that I wanted to talk about with Ursula K Le Guin is the Flyers of Ghee. G-Y is the name of it, Flyers of Ghee. And what it is that there is a group of people who are very much like humans, except that 1 out of 10 people end up sprouting wings. Okay, and these people who sprout wings are treated despicably. They're thrown from cliffs, but they're considered to be very artistic. They're poets, and it's looked down upon if they have children, because you have these people flying with holding a baby and so on. And so it took me about 3 readings of this book, or pardon me, of that particular story. As I was going through it, I was trying to figure out what is it that she's commenting on. And then I got 1 in 10. And then the idea of, they're called flighty as well, the people with wings, they're called flighty. And so it took me 3 times, and I'm like, this is a commentary on the treatment of LGBTQ people in our society. It took me, I'm embarrassed to say, it took me 3 times of reading it to realize that this is what it was, is that, and this is what I mean when I say that they're able to comment obliquely on social issues that would be considered to be sensitive or controversial, that what we see is in fact making a very clear condemnatory statement saying, look at what we have done, right? Look at what we have done to these people. And once you realize it, once I teach students and they go, oh, because it's GY, right? And I leave a little space on the board when I'm writing it up and I write an A between it. And it's like, oh, right? That you suddenly realize that this is what she's commenting on. And so once again, I wanted to bring up Ursula K Le Guin because of that social commentary, that's very clearly what it is that she's doing. And we can see that she's doing it very consciously, but I would argue that we can see that even in narratives that are not necessarily clearly commentating on contemporary society, that nevertheless it still exists. Finally, this is going to be the last thing I talk about before I open it up to any questions that you may have, is Guy Gavriel Kay's Tigana. Guy Kay is a Canadian fantasist. He was a lawyer. He wrote for Street Legal, the TV show. He actually worked on the Silmarillion with Christopher Tolkien as well. So he comes from a pedigree of that high fantasy literature that he helped Christopher Tolkien put the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion, incidentally, is sort of pre-Lord of the Rings, J.R. Tolkien, for those of you who don't know, but created or helped edit the Silmarillion with Christopher Tolkien, John's son, and then began writing, and he began with the Fionnevar tapestry, okay, that he effectively, throughout all of his writing, has this, you might think of it as an world called Fionnevar, that's sort of the primary world, the primary plane, and all of these other worlds that he has always have some kind of reference to Finnevar or Finbar or what are called grace notes to Fionnevar, this prime world. And that story begins on campus at the University of Toronto, because as everyone knows, that's the center of the universe, right? So it starts at the University of Toronto, and then it moves into this other plane, Fionnevar. But Tigana takes place in another one of these subset worlds. And all of Guy Kay's texts, all of his novels, in some way reference Earth history. And so the Palm, which is the name of the island that the events occur in, the Palm is in fact based on the period of the Italian city-states, okay, so the warring Italian city-states. And so instead of a boot of Italy, you have the palm, okay, of Tigana. And so this palm looks kind of like this, okay? And there are 5 different provinces within the palm, and they're all at war. And what happens is that one tyrant comes from the east to take over some of them, and one tyrant comes from the west to take over. And so what we end up seeing is competing the power of 2 external sorcerers coming in and taking over and colonizing this land. Alberico from the east is pure evil. He's just purely evil. Brandon from the west has got some redeeming features. One of which is that he lets his son take over the province of Tigana. So he leads the armies, and this is before the novel even begins. He leads the armies to crush the Tiganese rebellion in Tigana. And Stephen is his name, and he is killed in the battle. And so Brandon is so upset by this that what he does is he decides he's going to crush Tigana. He takes away the art. In other words, once again, that immortality that we talked about before. He destroys the statues. He destroys the towers of the capital city, and he takes away the name. Okay, so that what he does is he actually erases the name Tigana, so that people say Tigana Tighanese are still able to say Tigana, but no one can hear it. Okay, so that he's actually erased language. He's erased the name of a group of people. And so it's no longer Tigana, but Lower Corte. Okay, so he's provided, and it's quite significantly Lower Corte. And so what we end up with then is an attempt of a group of Tighanese to come back and reclaim Tigana, the name, the province, and the power, and so on. And I, once again, strongly encourage you to read this. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, just in general. And so what ends up happening is, just to sort of talk about geography to wrap up this talk on mapping. So we have the map of the palm that we see. What ends up happening, though, is that for sorcerers in Tigana to gain power, what they have to do is they have to take their right hand and sever one of the fingers to make it look like the palm. So the power of the magic system within Tigana is actually rooted specifically in the land itself, in the geography itself. And they discover, they later discover, these rebels later discover an ancient form of magic that literally comes from the land. Okay, it's sort of an ancient pagan kind of magic that exists. And they use both forms of magic to have the two tyrant sorcerers fight each other, and then they reclaim Tigana, and all is well, as it were. I'm not going to ruin the end of it, because I do encourage you to read it. But that is the story of Tigana. And so just to sort of summarize what we talked about, that we think of fantasy literature as just escapist, as just imaginative stuff, as people creating worlds and just doing these things, not really in any way contributing to the world. And I would like to argue, in fact, the exact opposite, that in creating worlds, these fantasists are, in fact, attempting to make this world a better place. And they are rooted in the epic tradition, and they are commenting on our world. And without the thinking of Star Trek, without the thinking of speculative fiction, and without the commentary of fantasists, we would not necessarily have the world that we have today. Thank you. Oh, sorry, that was quite long. I apologize for that.
With your comments about removing that whole culture.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Does that also perhaps look closely at the whole aspect of Western Europeans in their colonization efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, that absolutely it's commenting on colonization. That it's an explicit sort of statement of indigeneity in Canada, for instance, but absolutely that colonizing power that we see coming into the palm absolutely is a comment on colonization and colonial the colonial project in general. Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And one of the questions I ask my students about Tigana is, could this only be written by a Canadian? Right? Because in Canadian literature, this is what we talk about, is the role of the land, the role of the landscape in Canadian literature. And the landscape plays such an important part of Tigana. Is that a fantasy that is really highly inflected by Canada itself, by the nation from which the writer comes? So, yeah. Yes?
You mentioned a couple of times, like, if you play role-playing games and things like
yes.
that. That all kind of springs out of Tolkien's world building, like extensive world building.
Absolutely.
Especially the Field of our Tapestry, I believe that even plays like a crucial pivotal role in kicking off that entire series of books that Kay writes. Can you talk a little bit more about world building, feeding world building, feeding world building?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And just talking about world building. Yeah, so Tolkien wrote his work, and again, it became sort of a shibboleth. It became kind of a password, right? That people would say orcs and elves and so on. And you go, oh, you've read Tolkien, right? And you see Led Zeppelin writing songs about Golem, the evil one, who came and slipped away with her, right? So this influence of, and people in the 1960s wore buttons that said Gandalf for president, right? Would be a great improvement now, I think. Yeah, so we have that, and again, that world building of the Iliad leads into potentially Beowulf. I'm not suggesting that the poet of Beowulf read the Iliad or anything like that, but certainly we have this in some ways a kind of shorthand, right? That you look back and say, okay, here's something from the epic tradition, I'm able to say this and we all understand it because it's a part of our culture. And so this idea then of world building within world building within world building, that we get these often those references, those oblique references to other literary works as well. And when Gary Gygax was creating Dungeons and Dragons, the Tolkien estate actually came after him because he had hobbits initially, and so he had to change them into halflings, and actually, so D&D is very clearly derived from Tolkien as well, right? But elves and orcs existed in literature outside of Tolkien, so he didn't necessarily need to change those words. That's why they exist in D&D. I don't know if that answered your question, but it allowed me to ramble a little bit, so thanks. Yes?
I can't recall the writer's name. He's from Spain, and Shadow of the Wind.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that.
Part of actually a trilogy, actually 4 books, and in that particular one, he actually has drawn a map that I think accurately represents Barcelona.
Oh, wow.
Within the map, there's a repository for what they call the Cemetery of Lost Books.
Oh, cool.
And
Wow.
so actually I think he did another sequel to that as well, too. But what's the one we were reading now? The Labyrinth of the Spirits, the other one.
Labyrinth of the Spirits.
Back in the 1930s and brings up to the 70s. Actually, fascinating. Really.
I'm gonna have to take a look at that. Thank you.
And what really struck me as well is just the beauty in the writing, which I would attribute as equally well to the translator, I would suppose, as to the original author. So do these translators, do they get the kind of recognition that they perhaps deserve? Or?
I don't think they do. That's a good question. I don't think they do, and I know Gavriel K's works have been translated into numerous languages, but again, I wouldn't be able to name one of the translators, for instance, right? So, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I'll have to get the spelling of that
Yes.
Canadian book you were talking about.
Tigana. Yes. Okay. Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your presence today. Thank you.